Part 2. Lessons from Cyber Espionage. 5. Certificates gone rogue, the DigiNotar compromise, and the Internet's fragile trust infrastructure. The first outward sign that something was wrong came on Saturday, August 27, 2011, and seemed fairly innocuous. A user in Iran couldn't check his Google Mail account. Strangely, when he connected to a virtual private network that disguised his location, the problem disappeared. Whatever was going on, it seemed only to affect computers in Iran. Concerned that the problem might be tied to the Iranian government or his local internet service provider, the user posted a question about the issue to the Gmail help forum under the username Alibo. 2 days later, Google responded with a public statement about the incident, attributing it to security problems at a Dutch company, DigiNotar. On September 20, 2011, less than a month after Alibo's post, DigiNotar was declared bankrupt, and the company was liquidated shortly thereafter. In just over a month, the public disclosure of a cybersecurity incident had not only doomed a well-respected technology company, it had also spurred the Dutch government to take the unprecedented step of taking over that company's operations. Compared to the typical consequences victims face in the aftermath of suffering high-profile security breaches, bad publicity, public apologies, lawsuits, these were pretty extreme penalties. But the DigiNotar compromise was not like other security incidents. For one thing, it was much harder to understand for most Internet users because it did not involve a company that people trusted to keep their data safe, failing to protect that information. Rather, it involved a company that Internet users trusted to tell them whom they could trust online, failing to do its job, and in doing so, revealing the fragility of the largely hidden infrastructure that enables computers to make decisions about which websites to load or which software updates to run. DigiNotar was a certificate authority, CA, meaning it issued digital certificates to its customers, who included many organizations and website owners. Certificate authorities provide website operators with the tools for encrypting communications with their users and confirming to those users, through their browsers, that they are actually communicating with the website associated with the URL displayed in the browser, not some other imposter website. In some cases, websites also ask CAs to vouch that the entity operating the website is who they say they are. For instance, that bankofamerica.com is actually operated by the business Bank of America, and not just whoever purchased that domain name. Not all website operators have their identity verified by a CA through a process called extended validation, but many websites with a high risk of impersonation or attempted fraud, such as banks, choose to pay for the additional service. These certificates allow web browsers to verify they are loading the correct websites that are actually operated by the owner of a given domain name and enable encrypted communication with those sites. Digital certificates also help operating systems verify that software updates have really been issued by the companies they claim to come from, and are not just malware masquerading as important updates. DigiNotar was well regarded. The Dutch government obtained many of its certificates from them, and that made all the difference in an industry founded entirely on the question of who could be trusted to tell other people and their devices whom to trust. DigiNotar was a root CA, root certificate authority, for all of the major browsers and operating systems. which meant that pretty much every popular web browser and operating system trusted all of the certificates issued by DigiNotar by default. Getting on those root lists or purchasing a certificate from a company that was on those lists was a key part of being able to participate in the online trust ecosystem. Anyone can issue certificates, but those certificates are of little value unless web browsers are willing to recognize them as meaningful and valid by adding their issuer to the root list of trusted CAs. So browser and operating system manufacturers screen CAs to decide whose certificates to trust, and CAs, in turn, screen website operators and organizations to decide who is worthy of their seal of approval. As the central trust brokers of the Internet, CAs tend to take security very seriously. If someone can compromise a root CA's systems and start issuing rogue certificates signed by that CA, as happened in the DigiNotar case, then all of those rogue certificates will automatically be honored as legitimate by browser and software vendors and all of their customers because they carry a trusted CA's signature. In the wrong hands, that signature is a powerful and dangerous tool because it affords criminals the opportunity to co-opt the trust of everyone who puts their faith in their browser or operating system to tell them what websites they should load or what software they should download. Accordingly, certificate issuing systems at reputable CAs are typically very heavily guarded. DigiNotar was no exception. The company kept its certificate issuing computers in rooms that could only be entered after completing biometric scans. Its signing keys were stored on physical keycards locked in vaults, and the computer networks were segmented according to how sensitive the functions each part performed were, with no fewer than 157 distinct firewall rules monitoring and restricting traffic between each zone, as well as an intrusion prevention system monitoring incoming Internet traffic. And yet, all that security proved little help in the face of a determined adversary who has never been definitively identified, but does not appear to have been interested in financial profits. The intruder chose instead to spy on the Google accounts of Iranian users, leading many people to conclude that the Iranian government was in some fashion behind the incident, that the incident was driven by espionage rather than financial greed, made it more difficult to detect, as well as easier for DigiNotar to try to conceal, since the early indications that a security breach has occurred often come in the form of financial clues, fraudulent charges, newly opened accounts, surprise wire transfers, ransom demands. Part of what made the DigiNotar compromise both scary and effective was how few clues the perpetrators left behind to indicate that anything out of the ordinary was happening. That Alibo noticed that something serious was awry and was savvy enough to understand it as a problem with the website certificates was nothing short of astonishing. The DigiNotar incident laid bare the profound interdependence and equally profound public misunderstanding of the Internet's trust infrastructure, that security flaws at a small company in the Netherlands could lead to the compromise of hundreds of thousands of Iranian email accounts, came as a shock to many Internet users unfamiliar with digital certificates and how they work. But even after the incident made international headlines, the DigiNotar incident did little to mitigate people's ignorance of certificate authorities and digital certificates. Instead, the significance of this news was ultimately obscured by people's confusion over how this largely invisible infrastructure operates and their inability to understand how it ties into their daily online experience. Outside the small communities of people who worked in browser and CA security, the DigiNotar compromise was significantly underappreciated and misunderstood, precisely because those same small communities had for years so effectively shielded users from the complicated technical underpinnings of how browsers decide which websites to trust. For the web browser and CA industries, DigiNotar was a warning sign of how much they stood to lose and how vulnerable their industries were. The incident would be referenced in their security discussions and decision-making for years to come, and serve as a constant reminder to these firms that their security failures could have serious consequences for people all over the world. Just as the TJX breach stirred long-lasting debates over how responsibility for fraud should be balanced between retailers, banks, and payment networks, the DigiNotar compromise raised crucial issues about the interplay of different companies, especially certificate authorities and web browsers, when it comes to security. In the wake of the DigiNotar incident, many firms found themselves revisiting the key question: how much responsibility does each of those groups have to protect users from deceptive sites and software, and to what extent can they and should they trust each other? Through the firewalls and past the sluice doors. The breach of DigiNotar's security was not noticed publicly until August 2011, but leading up to that moment were months of careful planning and deliberate probing by a perpetrator who gradually wended his way through many, many layers of elaborate security controls. The intruder's first access to the company's network came on June 17, 2011, investigators found, when two web servers on the outskirts of DigiNotar's network, that is, the least protected segment, or external demilitarized zone, DMZ, which connected to the outside Internet, were compromised. The two servers were, at the time, running an outdated and vulnerable version of the Web Content Management System .NET Nuke, which enabled the compromise. An intrusion prevention system, IPS, monitored traffic that came through the DigiNotar router responsible for Internet connectivity, but it failed to block the initial intrusion. This failure was perhaps due in part to DigiNotar's deciding to run the IPS in its default configuration and position it in front of the company's firewalls, where it registered a large number of false positives when perfectly harmless online traffic was flagged as being a possible intrusion. Once inside the external demilitarized zone portion of DigiNotar's network, however, there were still significant barriers to producing rogue certificates. Firewalls delineated several separate zones of the network, configured such that the external DMZ could only send traffic to an internal DMZ segment of the network. The two DMZ zones together were intended to prevent direct connections between the Internet and the internal DigiNotar network used to generate certificates. Neither DMZ could initiate connections to SecureNet, where the certificate issuing systems resided. Instead, a SecureNet service regularly collected the certificate requests that were sent by customers via the company's website and stored on a server in the internal DMZ. Each request then had to be vetted and approved by two people before being processed by DigiNotar's main production servers, which were located on SecureNet and kept in a room protected by numerous physical security measures. A report commissioned by the Dutch government on the incident describes the security measures protecting the room where the DigiNotar certificate production servers were kept. This room could be entered only if authorized personnel used a biometric hand recognition device and entered the correct PIN code. This inner room was protected by an outer room connected by a set of doors that opened dependent on each other, creating a sluice. These sluice doors had to be separately opened with an electronic door card that was operated using a separate system than for any other door. To gain access to the outer room from a publicly accessible zone, another electronic door had to be opened with an electronic card. This was not a company that took issues of security, whether virtual or physical, lightly. Following his initial compromise of the web servers in the external DMZ, the intruder used these servers as stepping stones, beginning on June 29, to tunnel traffic between that zone of the network and the internal OfficeNet zone. On July 2, connections from the CA servers in the SecureNet segment of the network were also initiated to the compromised servers in the external DMZ. That traffic was then tunneled back to the intruder's IP addresses from the outward-facing external DMZ portion of the network. The intruder appeared to have bypassed DigiNotar's security zone firewalls by taking advantage of their numerous exceptions. Investigators later identified 156 rules in the firewalls detailing which interconnections were allowed and disallowed between zones. The intruder set up a remote desktop connection using port 3389, which was then tunneled through port 443, generally used for HTTPS, so that the traffic could get past the firewall. Having bypassed the zoning firewalls and accessed the SecureNet servers, the intruder still could not issue a certificate from a DigiNotar CA server without activating the corresponding private key in the hardware security module, NetHSM, using a physical smart card. The activation process required an authorized employee to insert a smart card into the NetHSM, which was stored in the same highly secured room as the CA servers, and then enter a PIN code. However, evidence collected after the incident suggested that some of those smart cards may have been permanently left in the NetHSM to allow for automatic generation of certificate revocation lists, CRLs, the lists of serial numbers of certificates that are no longer trusted. Since issuing a CRL also required that the appropriate private key be activated on the NetHSM, the private keys of those CA servers that generated CRLs automatically were probably always activated, and the keycards therefore left permanently inserted in them. Otherwise, the servers would be unable to perform that function. If, as the DigiNotar investigators hypothesized, this was the case, then any attempts to issue rogue certificates on those servers would have been successful, even without physical access to the smart cards, because those smart cards would have been left in the NetHSM to allow for automatic generation of CRLs. DigiNotar had many lines of defense in place to prevent intruders from being able to issue rogue certificates. An IPS meant to keep them off the company's network entirely, a set of firewalls intended to further restrict access to the CA servers, a 4I principle that required certificate requests to be approved by 2 people before being processed, and physical keycards that had to be activated from within a room protected by many other forms of security. The capabilities that the perpetrator exploited, connecting to an outward-facing web server, compromising the out-of-date .NET Nuke software to connect to other servers, navigating the maze of firewalls to find exceptions that would allow tunneling between the different network zones over specific ports, and using the always activated private keys intended to allow automatic generation of CRLs, seemed to stem in large part from a set of overly complex and arcane security measures rather than too few defensive efforts or negligence. How the rogue certificates were used and stopped. Having made it past the many layers of DigiNotar security, the intruder was still a long way from being able to access the email accounts of Iranians like Alibo. Since the perpetrator has never been apprehended, his motivation for infiltrating DigiNotar and issuing hundreds of certificates remains somewhat unclear, as does the extent to which he was successful in achieving his ultimate aims. The only known significant consequence of the breach, beyond the damage done to DigiNotar, was a man-in-the-middle, MITM, attack that redirected visitors like Alibo, who were trying to access Google websites. The redirection affected users from 298,140 unique IP addresses, 95% of which originated from Iran. While any Google service could have been the focus of this redirection, and no specifics about what the users were trying to do or what happened on the websites they were redirected to can be gleaned from the rogue certificate logs, the report commissioned by the Dutch government speculates as to the possible purposes of this attack. Most likely, the confidentiality of Gmail accounts was compromised, and their credentials, the login cookie, and the contents of their emails could have been intercepted. Using the credentials or the login cookie, an attacker may be able to log in directly to the Gmail mailbox of the victim and read their stored emails. Additionally, the MITM attacker may have been able to log into all other services that Google offers to users, such as stored location information from Latitude or documents in Google Docs. Once an attacker is able to receive his target's emails, he is also able to reset passwords of other services, such as Facebook and Twitter, using the lost password functionality. The security firm Fox IT investigated the incident for a year following its disclosure. Hans Hoogstraten, who led the Fox IT team and was the primary author on the investigation report, said he was astonished as he came to understand the potential impact the incident had in Iran. In those days, and today still, people got killed for having a different opinion, Hoogstraten said in an email recalling his reactions. The hackers, presumably the state, had access to over 300,000 Gmail accounts. The realization that the security of a small company in Holland played a part in the killing or torture of people really shocked me. Hoogstraten also pointed out that media coverage of the incident was largely focused on the consequences of the compromise for the Dutch government, which had to revoke several of its certificates, even though, to Hoogstraten's mind, they, the Dutch government, had suffered only some inconvenience compared with the people of Iran. But for the media, as well as for Hoogstraten's investigative team, there was little concrete evidence of what, if anything, had actually happened to the people in Iran who were tricked by the rogue certificates. Clearly, there is some reason to believe that the attacker's objective may have been to gather information about the email, location, and other online activity of the Iranians, but there is very little indication of what the perpetrator intended to do with that information. In fact, the only clue left by the intruder, a message saved in a text file left behind on a compromised DigiNotar server, suggests that, for him at least, the compromise was intended primarily to demonstrate his skills rather than to drive any specific malicious mission. The perpetrator boasts in the message, "I know you are shocked of my skills, how I got access to your network, to your internal network from outside, how I got full control on your domain controller, how I got logged into this computer, how I bypassed your expensive firewalls, net HSM, unbreakable hardware keys, how I did all XUDA programming without one line of resource, got this idea, owned your network accesses, your domain controlled, got all your passwords, signed my certificates, and received them shortly. There is no any hardware or software in this world exists which could stop my heavy attacks, my brain, or my skills, or my will, or my expertise. That's all okay. Everything I do is out of imagination of people in world. I know you'll see this message when it is too late. Sorry for that. The tone of the message is at odds with the subtlety and discretion of the compromise itself, designed to evade detection or attention for as long as possible. The real threat of a CA compromise is that, if successful, a perpetrator can use rogue certificates to operate under the radar and evade many online security mechanisms for an extended period of time. This is perfectly in keeping with the aims of espionage efforts, but less in keeping with the character of an arrogant, attention-seeking criminal who wants someone to notice his skill and appreciate his genius. And while the intruder was ultimately right, and his message was not found until it was already too late for DigiNotar, that outcome was not nearly so inevitable as he assumed. In fact, the events that followed the perpetrator's elaborate intrusion into the DigiNotar network and successful production of rogue certificates indicate there were early warning signs that DigiNotar failed to fully appreciate. The company would not find the intruder's message until it was decidedly too late to help them or the Iranian users affected by the compromise. But that was in large part due to their ignoring or overlooking several important clues, and DigiNotar was not alone in missing opportunities to detect or interrupt the scheme. DigiNotar, like TJX and the SCDOR, operated in the context of a large and complicated ecosystem of stakeholders, each of whom could have played a stronger defensive role in catching and preventing the use of rogue certificates. To catch a rogue certificate. Much of DigiNotar's security was focused on stopping anyone from being able to control its certificate production servers and issue rogue certificates. But the company did employ one security mechanism to check for the creation of rogue certificates after the fact. DigiNotar ran regular automated tests to confirm that it had records of issuing every certificate listed in its database of serial numbers. It was this test that first detected the existence of some rogue certificates in mid-July 2011 and led to their revocation. But while the testing detected several rogue certificate serial numbers, for which there were no associated administrative records, it failed to find and revoke many others, probably because the intruder appears to have tampered with the database of serial numbers that the test verified. The incident investigation recovered versions of the serial_no.dbh database from the DigiNotar servers and found they contained additional unknown serial numbers, several of which corresponded to rogue certificates that were therefore not detected by the automated test. Using rogue certificates to spy on Iranians, assuming that was indeed the end goal, required going through other intermediaries besides DigiNotar. Digital certificates bind a public encryption key to a particular entity using the digital signature of a trusted third party, such as DigiNotar. These signed certificates may be used for a variety of different purposes, to validate anything from a website to a software package to an individual. Rogue certificates can allow for impersonation of any of these entities, bypassing DigiNotar's vetting and approval process. So, malicious websites can masquerade as Google.com. Malicious individuals can take on the identities of other people. Malware can be attributed to legitimate software companies, all with the unwitting endorsement of DigiNotar in the form of its digital signature. That signature ensured, for instance, that many web browsers, operating systems, and document readers, as well as many Dutch government services, would automatically trust the identity of anything bearing a DigiNotar certificate. In other words, the value of the rogue certificates and their capability to cause damage derived not from the certificates themselves, but rather from the trust placed in them by numerous outside parties. A DigiNotar certificate was valuable to a website owner, for instance, because all of the major web browsers would trust and load any website that had been issued a DigiNotar certificate. The operating systems and browsers and other applications that rely on certificates present another opportunity for identifying rogue certificates, particularly if those stakeholders have their own means of verifying certificate validity, independent of DigiNotar, as Google Chrome did. Since Google operates both a browser and a number of online services, its browser knows exactly what certificates the company holds for the domain google.com. At the time of the DigiNotar compromise, these certificates were pinned in the Chrome browser, meaning that no other certificates for the google.com domain were accepted by Chrome, regardless of whether they were signed by trusted root CAs like DigiNotar. This certificate pinning enabled Chrome to warn users about malicious websites that used the rogue google.com certificate and subsequently prevent them from accessing those sites. These warnings were what first tipped off Alibo and Google itself to the existence of the rogue google.com certificate, leading ultimately to DigiNotar's public acknowledgement of the breach, the subsequent investigation, and the discovery of many other previously undetected fraudulent certificates. At the time of the DigiNotar compromise, certificate pinning was fairly limited. Since Google runs both Chrome and Gmail, it could tell its browser exactly which certificates should be trusted when attempting to access its email service, but it didn't have that information for every website. Since the DigiNotar incident, however, both CAs and browsers have made significant changes to their security. Certificate pinning has become more common and is now available not just to companies who manufacture their own browsers, but to any certificate owner that wants to publish the list of certificates it holds and ensure that no other certificates for its domains will be accepted by browsers. This approach has been adopted by some larger, frequently targeted companies, but it is still not widespread, largely because it is relatively easy to shoot yourself in the foot with it, according to Rick Andrews, Senior Technical Director for Website Security at Symantec, one of the largest CAs in the world. If a website pins a set of certificates, for instance, then browsers will reject any other certificates associated with that site for the duration of the pinning, so it becomes extremely difficult to start using a new certificate without advance notice. A savvy user with a well-protected browser containing pinned certificates was ultimately responsible for catching the DigiNotar compromise. But certificate pinning was not the only line of defense beyond the CA itself. The intruders' attempts to conduct espionage on Iranian Google users relied on his being able to convince the users of Google services that they were checking their email, or searching for directions, or watching videos, when in fact they were actually visiting a malicious site controlled by him. The DigiNotar certificate, trusted by all major browsers, would serve to persuade users that his fraudulent site was legitimately operated by Google. But first, he had to get them to his site. Otherwise, the forged certificate was useless. This meant redirecting Iranian internet traffic so that users who attempted to visit Google websites were sent instead to the malicious sites without their knowledge, using a man-in-the-middle attack that intercepted their queries before the actual Google sites could load. This process involved yet another group of stakeholders who had the potential to help prevent the perpetrator's success, even after he had completely penetrated DigiNotar's systems and successfully produced rogue certificates. There are a few different ways to perpetrate an MITM attack that redirects users' online traffic. One is to intercept traffic at users' upstream provider by inspecting their packets and redirecting those intended for certain destinations. In this case, the service provider transmitting the Iranian user's packets would either have to be complicit in the attack or be compromised by the attacker. It is unlikely that this was the approach used by the DigiNotar intruder, however, since 5% of the IP addresses that were affected by the rogue Google.com certificate originated outside of Iran. If the redirection had been done by or through Iranian service providers, these users would likely not have been affected. If the perpetrators of the DigiNotar breach did not compromise Internet service providers to redirect traffic to their fraudulent websites, then they probably took advantage of the web's addressing directory, the domain name system, or DNS, which maintains records of which URLs map to which servers online. The DNS serves as a sort of address book for the Internet, containing records of which URLs map to which IP addresses and other information associated with those servers. Whenever a user visits a web page by typing in a domain name, the browser fetches a DNS record associated with that domain that in turn tells it which IP address to connect to in order to load the desired web page for the user. These records are stored on high-level DNS servers that send them to other servers further down the DNS hierarchy. Every time a user tries to load a web page, their computer queries one of these DNS servers to find the specific address where that web page is stored. So, by altering the contents of these DNS records, the DigiNotar intruder could redirect people trying to get to Google.com to any other site of the intruder's choosing, simply by changing the addressing information stored in local DNS servers. This is almost certainly the approach taken in the DigiNotar-related redirection. According to subsequent analysis, the rogue certificate's use was extremely bursty. That is, at certain times, the certificate's use would spike dramatically and then decline over and over again. This suggested that the MITM attack was most likely carried out by DNS cache poisoning, or flooding low-level DNS servers with forged messages containing incorrect information for Google.com and pretending they'd been sent by a higher-level DNS server. This technique poisons the targeted record for some period of time, since the lower-level DNS server believes the information has come from a higher-level DNS server and updates it accordingly. This poisoning lasts until the responses expire, and the DNS server makes another request to a higher-level server. The brief lifetime of these poisoning attacks would explain the erratic up-and-down volume of requests to validate the rogue Google.com certificate over time. Redirecting traffic in this manner introduces a new set of defenders who can help protect against the successful exploitation of rogue SSL certificates. DNS operators. For instance, by implementing DNS security extensions, DNS SEC, to verify the senders of DNS records they receive, or disregarding records that are received in the absence of a particular query, DNS operators might reduce the ease with which someone could perpetrate a cache-poisoning MITM attack. Ultimately, it was the web browsers, not the DNS operators, who were responsible for mitigating the consequences of the rogue DigiNotar certificates. In the wake of the DigiNotar compromise, the major web browsers removed DigiNotar from their list of trusted root CAs on the grounds that if someone had successfully issued one rogue DigiNotar certificate, there might well be more, as indeed there were. As the ultimate arbiters of which CAs to trust, browsers wield significant power in dictating which certificates the general population of web users will accept by default. In the aftermath of the DigiNotar compromise, as it became clear that the much-vaunted security procedures of even the most well-respected CAs were vulnerable, browser manufacturers became increasingly willing to embrace this role, occasionally courting open conflict with CAs they deemed irresponsible or insecure. Tensions over trustworthiness. Browsers versus CAs. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery of the DigiNotar compromise, browser manufacturers were left scrambling to figure out how to deal with a set of active rogue certificates without greatly inconveniencing their users. In a blog post published on September 3, 2011, a member of the response team at Mozilla, Jervis Markham, described Mozilla's attempts to contact DigiNotar and their ultimate decision to remove DigiNotar from their list of trusted root CAs for Mozilla Firefox. We decided to take this action based on the fact that we no longer had sufficient confidence in DigiNotar's trustworthiness, Markham wrote, citing DigiNotar's decision not to notify browsers when it first detected rogue certificates in July, as well as its inadequate logging practices and misleading press statements as factors that contributed to this decision. Microsoft, Apple, and Google ultimately did the same for their browsers, Internet Explorer, Safari, and Chrome, as well as their operating systems. But removing a root CA was not an easy or immediate process for the browser vendors. We actually needed to push out an update to Firefox because the CA information was hard-coded to the browser, Firefox security lead Richard Barnes said. Additionally, there were many legitimate websites, including some operated by the Dutch government, that still relied on DigiNotar certificates and would have been severely affected if browsers stopped accepting their certificates, so the browser vendors were forced to hold off on a blanket ban. Instead, Mozilla decided to block all DigiNotar certificates issued after July 1, 2011, but allowed users to decide whether or not they wanted to trust certificates issued by the company before that date. That decision gave users some flexibility, but also assumed they would have some understanding of what had happened to DigiNotar and how digital certificates worked in order to make up their minds about which ones they wanted to trust. While the browsers focused on how to minimize the impact of the breach, other CAs were also alarmed by the incident. DigiNotar was a real wake-up call for the entire industry, said Symantec's Rick Andrews. It forced both the CA and the browser communities to revisit the question of what appropriate security guidelines and standards were for CAs. A year after the incident, on August 3, 2012, the Certificate Authority Browser (CAB) Forum, a group of CAs and browser vendors that collaborate to produce security recommendations and information about best practices, adopted a new set of guidelines for how CAs should protect their networks. Andrews, who was involved in the discussions leading up to the development of these security requirements, said they were driven in large part by what had gone wrong in the DigiNotar case. We were often talking about, is this a mistake that DigiNotar made? Or, would this new text prevent a DigiNotar-type event from happening? The CAB forum is intended to allow browsers and CAs to work together to protect Internet users. But in fact, these two industries have very different goals and priorities that do not always align with one another's, or even necessarily with the security of their users. The business model of a CA is dependent on selling certificates to customers, so a CA always wants to sell as many as possible without alienating any of the major browsers. The major browsers, on the other hand, all compete with each other for users, so they want to give those users the best possible online experience and are often wary of blocking people from visiting websites they're trying to reach in the name of certificate concerns those users are unlikely to understand. If one browser decides to take a strong stance on blocking sites with invalid or suspicious certificates, it's possible their customers will switch over to one of their competitors with lower security standards that allows users to view whatever they want. There's a little bit of a race to the bottom within the browser community in terms of making stronger security decisions, explained Daniel Kahn Gilmore, a senior staff technologist with the ACLU's Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project. On top of that, it's not always clear where a CA's responsibility for security ends and a browser's responsibility begins. If a CA is responsible for vetting websites and a browser is responsible for vetting CAs, then when something like the DigiNotar breach occurs, who is ultimately to blame? The CA whose systems were breached, or the browsers who failed to recognize that one of the CAs they trusted had inadequate security protections in place? This is another variation of the same dilemma that TJX and Visa and MasterCard faced, and that the SCDOR and the IRS and TrustWave grappled with, minus the financial stakes and incentives. When several different organizations are highly interconnected and interdependent, whose fault is it when something goes wrong, and who gets to decide? Both CAs and browsers have made significant changes to their security practices since DigiNotar. Certificate pinning, the practice responsible for revealing the compromise publicly, has become more common and is now available not just to companies who manufacture their own browsers, but also to any certificate holder that wants to publish the list of certificates it holds and ensure that no other certificates for its domains will be accepted by browsers. Another initiative, called Certificate Transparency, encourages CAs to publish publicly accessible logs listing every valid certificate they have issued, so domain owners can monitor whether any certificates have been issued for their domains without their knowledge. In the aftermath of DigiNotar's demise, when browsers were wary of trusting even the most reputable CAs to make security decisions, certificate transparency was heavily pushed on the CA community by browser manufacturers. In 2016, Google announced that it would no longer display the green address bar in Chrome signaling the presence of a valid certificate, unless a website's extended validation certificates had also been logged according to the Certificate Transparency Protocol. This sort of back and forth between CAs and browsers is not uncommon, and the browsers often hold the upper hand in these negotiations, since they ultimately decide which websites users can load easily and which subtle security signals, green bars, lock and shield icons, are conveyed to those users. Many popular browsers use some combination of these signals in their browser bars to indicate to users when they are viewing websites with valid certificates, whether those certificates include additional extended validation verification of the website operator's identities, and when their communications with those websites are being encrypted. On the other hand, browsers are constrained by how little their users know about certificates and the possibility that those users will therefore blame their browser when a web page doesn't load immediately. On March 20, 2015, years after the collapse of DigiNotar, Google discovered another set of rogue certificates for Google domains. These certificates had been issued by an Egyptian company, MCS Holdings, which had in turn received its certificates from CNNIC, the CA operated by the China Internet Network Information Center, an agency in the Chinese government's Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. Soon afterwards, Mozilla and Google decided to distrust some CNNIC certificates due to concerns that they'd been used by a CNNIC customer to conduct MITM attacks and intercept other users' online traffic in a manner similar to that of the DigiNotar intruder. The following year, in August 2016, another Chinese CA, WoSign, was accused of issuing fake certificates for GitHub and Alibaba and backdating certificates to avoid meeting security requirements that went into effect for CAs at the beginning of 2016. Apple, Mozilla, and Google Chrome subsequently revoked their trust in WoSign-issued certificates in October 2016. Conflicts like these between American tech companies and Chinese CAs, especially the CNNIC CA operated by the Chinese government, are not just technical, they're also deeply political in nature. The decision to distrust certificates issued even indirectly, or, as CNNIC later claimed, accidentally by the Chinese government, is a fraught one for companies that have users and customers all over the world. Fundamentally, the question of whom a technology is designed to trust reflects a value-laden judgment about whom its designer trusts. Each CA gets to make its own decisions about whom to issue certificates to, and each browser or operating system vendor then makes decisions about which of those CAs to trust, and all of those decisions are influenced by where the people making them live and which government or governments they are accountable to. While there are hundreds of CAs operating all over the world, there are only a small number of popular web browsers, almost all of which are manufactured by US-based companies. So these international conflicts over whom the international community of Internet users should trust can have complicated geopolitical dynamics, in addition to complicated technical dimensions. Not every CA browser conflict is international, however. One of the most dramatic disagreements in this space involved a US-based CA rather than an overseas one. In March 2017, Google Chrome threatened to reduce the level of trust it accorded to certificates issued by CA giant Symantec, which issues more than 30% of the certificates used online. Chrome engineer Ryan Sleevey explained the decision in a post accusing Symantec of granting 4 parties access to their infrastructure in a way to cause certificate issuance, and failing to oversee those parties or respond appropriately when the problem was brought to their attention. Sleevey couched those shortcomings as a failure to uphold the broader principles that Google expects of its root CAs. He wrote, "Root certificate authorities are expected to perform a number of critical functions commensurate with the trust granted to them. This includes properly ensuring that domain control validation is performed for server certificates, to audit logs frequently for evidence of unauthorized issuance, and to protect their infrastructure in order to minimize the ability for the issuance of fraudulent certs. On the basis of the details publicly provided by Symantec, we do not believe that they have properly upheld these principles, and as such, have created significant risk for Google Chrome users." Symantec quickly fired back, issuing a statement of its own just days later, in which it called Google's accusations exaggerated and misleading. But the company ultimately caved and agreed to reissue and revalidate the certificates that Chrome had threatened to distrust. That concession indicated just how dramatically power had shifted to the browsers in dictating the terms of certificate issuance and security. After all, Google deciding to distrust Symantec certificates would have caused major headaches for its users, given how ubiquitous Symantec certificates are. Users might well have decided to abandon the browser for others that would let them view the websites they were trying to visit more easily. On the other hand, of course, Chrome users not being able to reach those sites would have been a huge blow to Symantec's customers, and they might well also have lost business to other websites whose web pages would load for the hundreds of millions of Chrome users. Both companies potentially stood to lose customers if Google followed through on the threat, but Google seemed to feel, and Symantec ultimately appeared to agree, that users would be more likely to blame the websites than the browsers for these inconveniences. The question of who gets blamed in these disputes is complicated by the complexity of the certificate infrastructure, which often makes it difficult for the wider public to understand how their browsers use certificates to decide what websites do and don't load, as well as how to interpret the signals and warnings that their browsers provide. One way to try to overcome this complexity is to focus on the impacts to the user rather than the underlying technology. It's difficult to understand what happened to DigiNotar, but relatively easy to understand that a bunch of people in Iran had their email accounts compromised. Along these lines, as part of a 2015 study by researchers at Google and the University of Pennsylvania, Google altered its warning message to users about websites with suspicious certificates. Originally, Chrome was using a message that began, "The site's security certificate is not trusted," and went on to explain, "You attempted to reach example.com, but the server presented a certificate issued by an entity that is not trusted by your computer's operating system. This may mean that the server has generated its own security credentials, which Chrome cannot rely on for identity information, or an attacker may be trying to intercept your communications. You should not proceed, especially if you have never seen this warning before for this site." In the revised message, intended to improve user understanding of what was going on, the researchers showed people a message with the title, "Your connection is not private," and the less technical explanation, "Attackers might be trying to steal your information from example.com, for example passwords, messages, or credit cards." But the changes in language had only a minimal impact, increasing the number of users who did not continue on to the site by just 1.2%. The challenges of trying to convey to users what's at stake when it comes to suspicious certificates or breaches like DigiNotar's highlight how difficult it is to sort out the different roles and responsibilities of the browsers and CAs when it comes to protecting users. This is especially true since security is neither industry's primary focus or aim. The main goal of CAs is to sell certificates. For browsers, it's to attract users. In cases like the DigiNotar compromise, where rogue certificates are used to conduct espionage rather than theft or financial fraud, users have no choice but to look for protection in this web of Internet company intermediaries because the crimes themselves are largely invisible, and financial intermediaries, banks, credit card companies, retailers, have no control or incentive to help. There are even fewer opportunities to protect users in the wake of an espionage-motivated breach as compared to a financially motivated one, and those opportunities mostly lie enshrouded in the mysterious trust infrastructure of the Internet, making it harder for anyone to know whom to blame or whom to hold responsible. The CAs are in a position of centralized authority with basically no checks or balances on them, Gilmore said. The CA ecosystem is hidden technology, and this is something technologists tend to do in general, hide all the messy underpinnings. Sometimes hiding technical details from the users can be helpful, but sometimes it can obscure where the positions of power are. Those positions of power are particularly messy when it comes to regulating the use of certificates online. The browser manufacturers want to protect their users, but their primary goal is to beat out the other competing browsers, and one way to do that is to make sure users can access the content they want as quickly and easily as possible, without encountering a lot of irritating, inscrutable warning messages. The CAs also, presumably, want to protect their customers by making sure they maintain their root trust status with the major browsers. But their primary goal is to sell as many certificates as possible, a goal slightly at odds with careful customer vetting or refusing to provide certificates to less than trustworthy applicants. Meanwhile, the CAs and browsers are fundamentally dependent on each other. Without browsers, certificates have little value, and without certificates, the browsers have no way of knowing whom to trust. It's a complicated setup largely devoid of any clearly defined expectations about who is ultimately responsible for the protection of online users. The browsers compete with each other and simultaneously try to coordinate their efforts to jointly vet CAs, while the CAs and browsers together negotiate the appropriate standards for issuing online certificates and subtly work to exercise their own power and influence without assuming responsibility for anyone's security. 6. No Doubt to Hack You, righted by Ugly Gorilla, China's PLA Unit 61398, and Economic Espionage. On February 8, 2010, 20 employees of U.S. Steel received an email from the company's chief executive officer, John Surma. The subject line read, "Meeting Invitation," and the agenda for the proposed meeting was also included as an attachment in a file titled simply agenda.zip. It was not until long after several of the recipients had opened the attachment and installed the contents on their computers that anyone realized the message had not, in fact, been sent by Surma, but instead by Sun Kai-liang, an officer in China's People's Liberation Army, PLA, Unit 61398, the branch of the PLA responsible for conducting cyber operations and signals intelligence from a 12-story building on Datong Road in the Pudong district of Shanghai. In 2010, few civilians in the United States had heard of PLA Unit 61398, but U.S. Steel's IT staff noticed several suspicious emails on their systems. The meeting invitation was only one of roughly 50 phishing messages that Swun sent during February 2010 to U.S. Steel employees, ostensibly from the company's own high-level executives. Many of those emails featured subject lines like U.S. Steel Industry Outlook and included links or attachments that, like the agenda.zip file, installed malware on the recipient's computers when clicked. In 2010, U.S. Steel was deeply embroiled in international trade disputes with Chinese steel manufacturers. Chinese companies, U.S. Steel had alleged, were receiving unfair subsidies from the Chinese government and dumping billions of dollars of steel pipes into the U.S. market at prices below what those same products were being sold for within China, and much lower than what U.S. steel manufacturers could afford to match. On February 8, when Swun's first phishing emails arrived, the Department of Commerce was just 2 weeks away from issuing its preliminary determination in one of these trade disputes, a determination that would ultimately lead to the placement of significant duties on Chinese imports of certain types of steel pipes. So, when Surma heard about the spate of phishing emails, one of which was even sent directly to him, he mentioned it to his friend David Hickton, a former classmate at Penn State who had gone on to become the U.S. Attorney for Western Pennsylvania. Phishing emails are messages that purport to be from legitimate or known senders, but are instead sent by imposters seeking to elicit useful information from recipients, such as passwords, or to deliver malware to the recipient's computer by means of a malicious attachment or website linked to in the message. That conversation launched Hickton on an investigation into Chinese cyber espionage efforts that culminated some 4 years later, on May 19, 2014, when he filed an indictment charging 5 PLA Unit 61398 officers, including Swun, with breaking into the computers of American companies. The indictment alleged that the officers had stolen information from U.S. companies' computers that would give an advantage to Chinese companies when it came to business negotiations, setting prices, resolving trade disputes, and developing new technologies. Hickton was not the only one investigating Unit 61398 during this period. On February 19, 2013, more than a year before Hickton filed his indictment of the PLA officers, the security firm Mandiant released a 75-page report titled APT-1, exposing one of China's cyber espionage units. This report described in detail a series of online espionage activities Mandiant had traced to Unit 61398 while investigating cybersecurity breaches all over the world. The APT of the title refers to China's military being an advanced persistent threat when it came to computer security breaches. By aggregating information about multiple incidents, Mandiant was able to conceal the identities of its clients as well as the specific breaches they experienced and offer an unusually comprehensive step-by-step deconstruction of an actual set of security incidents. This incident aggregation makes it difficult to pinpoint specific motivations driving the perpetrators or the actual harm they inflicted. But taken together, the incidents investigated by Mandiant make a compelling case that the type of breach experienced by U.S. Steel was no anomaly, but rather part of a broader pattern of behavior on the part of the Chinese government to access sensitive commercial and economic information. These breaches were perpetrated in order to steal data including intellectual property, business contracts or negotiations, policy papers, or internal memoranda, that could be used, generally, to benefit the Chinese government and Chinese businesses, according to Mandiant's analysis. The victims included 141 organizations that had been breached by PLA Unit 61398 since 2006, and the spoils of these intrusions included information related to product development, designs, and manuals, as well as manufacturing procedures, processes, and standards, along with business plans, legal documents, records detailing contract negotiation positions, mergers and acquisitions, meeting minutes and agendas, staff emails, and user credentials. The targets, primarily U.S.-based organizations, spanned 20 different sectors, though many victims worked in information technology, satellites and telecommunications, aerospace engineering, and public administration. As with other intrusions motivated by espionage rather than direct financial profit, including the DigiNotar compromise, it's not clear how, specifically, the stolen data acquired by the PLA was used, or what concrete harm, if any, its loss may have caused. Given the large number of targets and the variety of different industry sectors they span, this stolen information could have served a number of different functions, revealing anything from how proprietary products were developed to sensitive financial statements, so it is difficult to say precisely what advantage the perpetrators gained by stealing it, or how they may have used it to harm others. The 2014 indictment filed by Hickton alleges economic espionage and theft of trade secrets, but despite lengthy descriptions in the indictment of significant breaches aimed at 6 different target companies, those specific allegations refer only to a single archive file stolen from one particular victim, Westinghouse Electric Company. Similarly, the only concrete example of harm included in the Mandiant report is an incident in which China negotiated a significant reduction in the price of a major commodity with a wholesale firm whose networks were compromised at the time. The report notes, "This may be coincidental. However, it would be surprising if Unit 61398 could continue perpetrating such a broad mandate of cyber espionage and data theft if the results of the group's efforts were not finding their way into the hands of entities able to capitalize on them." But, while the final stages of these breaches, the ones that occurred after the successful theft of information, are sometimes hard to pin down, the early stages, involving the actual compromise of computer systems, are laid out clearly in Mandiant's analysis and Hickton's later indictment.